Hi, and welcome to Eminent Americans. I'm your host, Dan Oppenheimer, wandering Jew of the contemporary American intellectual scene. My guest today is Ken Ilgunis, wandering Gentile of the contemporary American intellectual scene. Ken is, among other things, a nature writer, an adventurer, a rewilding advocate, a Substacker and podcaster, a psychotherapy graduate student, a group fitness trainer, and a shaggy lawn evangelist. I almost a second ago called Ken a wandering wasp, which would have been a better pairing with wandering Jew. But that word, I think, conjures up images of men in Nantucket red slacks and women in fine linen, and Ken grew up in not-so-Tony environs, not-so-waspy environs in the sense that we think about it, but rather in a slightly frayed around the edges suburb in western New York. The son of a working-class Scottish immigrant father and a mother from North Tonawanda, New York, which is precisely where you imagine it might be, about midway between Buffalo and Niagara Falls. Ken's parents, by his own account, and we talk about this a little bit, were loving but not especially directive in terms of what they wanted or expected from their son after he left the perch, other than that they wanted him to take maybe another rung or two up the class ladder from their own modest ascent, which is something that Ken arguably has done, I think somewhat despite himself, though in a very roundabout way and probably more in a cultural and educational sense than in an economic one. His adult life, from graduating college until just a small number of years ago, and he's now in his mid-40s, was kind of an effort to solve the equation of traveling as much as he could around the world, usually alone, while still breaking even. So not going into debt, but also not building a lot of reserves. He just kind of went out into the world, natural and not so natural, and walked it, and walked, and walked, and walked, and boated, and hitchhiked, and drove, and hopped trains, and whatever other mode of transportation was available. He met wild people and wild animals, and he wrote. He's written various books, including Walden on Wheels, about, among other things, living in a van down by the river while in grad school at Duke, Trespassing Across America, about an often quite illegal sojourn along the proposed Keystone XL pipeline route. He wrote This Land Is Our Land, about the lost but maybe someday to be regained American right to roam freely across lands both public and private, so that future Ken sojourns would be not quite so illegal. He also wrote A Walk Across Suburbia, which is about a 3-day walk across the specific suburb where he grew up. I met Ken just a few years ago when he was already ensconced in the more domesticated phase of his life, married to a German-born artist who teaches at the University of Edinburgh, father of a very cute daughter, and homeowner in and civic-minded resident of a small, tidy village just a few train stops out from Edinburgh. I know it's a few train stops out because my family and I, last Thanksgiving, took that train from Edinburgh and had Thanksgiving with his family, a lovely vegetarian Thanksgiving dinner, the highlight of which, from a gastronomic perspective, was the vegetarian haggis, which is vastly superior, in my humble opinion, to the traditional intestinal kind of haggis, which I had once back when I was a study abroad student in Edinburgh in my early 20s. Have never had again, deliberately. Ken is now working on a book proposal called The Future Wild, which is about both current efforts to rewild the world in various ways, with methods both homespun and science fictional, and also what the natural world might look like if we give it a few hundred years to reassert itself, perhaps with some benevolent help along the way. So in this episode, we talk about all of the above. We talk about the new project. We talk about his hitchhiking trip in his early 20s from Alaska to Buffalo, New York, when he was just out of college and in debt, and the philosophy that drove it. We talk about American Prairie, which is the 3.2 million acre rewilding project in north central Montana that almost nobody's heard of, which Ken hiked across last year with his nephew and wrote about, and which he describes as maybe the boldest conservation project in the world. We talk about de-extinction, bringing back into existence ancient extinct animals or versions of them like the woolly mammoth and dire wolves, which is being spearheaded in particular at Colossal Biosciences, which Ken got a private tour of not too long ago, which he wrote about. We talk about whether depopulation is bad news or good news for the planet, whether environmentalism is sometimes its own worst enemy, and we just spend some time, some really kind of human time, on what it's like for Ken to have transitioned from the wandering phase, the purely wandering phase of his existence, to the at least somewhat domesticated aspect of his life, and what it's like to be someone who in some ways is a really hardcore introvert who always just wants to disappear into the wilderness for months at a time, usually on his own. And then the equally genuine part of himself that he's been finally kind of engaging, which wants a family and a home and a steady job and a role in a real community, a kind of rooted role in a community. What I dig about Ken's work and Ken as a person is just the mix of all these things, kind of his love of people, his love of the human communities, and also just his awe about the natural world and his capacity to kind of be fully cognizant of all of the environmental threats and the environmental damage that we've done, and then to still kind of wander the world and find it beautiful and amazing and full of potential. And just to kind of end on that and to give you a flavor of kind of some of what drives Ken's writing, he starts his recent 4-part Substack series on that epic hitchhiking trip from Alaska to Buffalo with this stanza from Jack London. So London writes, "I would rather that my spark should burn out in a brilliant blaze than it should be stifled by dry rot. I would rather be a superb meteor, every atom of me in magnificent glow, than a sleepy and permanent planet. The function of man is to live, not to exist. I shall not waste my days trying to prolong them. I shall use my time." So that's a part of Ken, and then there's the part of Ken I think that's about conservation and preservation and steadiness and stewardship and living with other people in a way that is not brightly meteoric, but rather steady and more, if not permanent, because nothing's permanent, then at least trying to create a vibe of safety and permanence and presence. Eminent Americans is produced in collaboration with the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis and distributed through its publication, ARC Magazine. You can find all of ARC's podcasts and much more at arcmag.org, arcmag.org. I really enjoyed this conversation with my comrade in wandering the world, wandering the expanses of our minds and our intellects. I hope you do too. Peace. Ken Ilgunis, welcome to Eminent Americans. I hereby anoint you an eminent American by the power vested in me by the slowly reawakening spirit of the American prairie.
It's a dream come true to be anointed by you. I know it's not a real thing, but it kind of feels like a real thing.
Well, what is real? I mean, I'm not literally anointing you with like oil or holy water, but I mean, I am symbolically anointing you. I think it's real.
I guess real would be kind of something, I don't know, like a ribbon or a certificate. This thing's been going on for 100 years. Have you ever done an in-person anointment, or is it just all virtual?
I think it's all virtual. Let me think about that. Like in a studio or in my house or something like that. Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's some sort of like liquid involved. Like what would the liquid be if you're anointing someone?
I mean, you've given me a lot to think about because there's two scenarios. One is if I were actually in person with somebody, what would the anointing be? And then two is, there could be kind of some sort of swag. Like I think Mark Maron had these custom mugs that some ceramicist made for him that he would give one to each of the guests or something like that. So I could, even virtually, I could mail off to somebody, whatever it is, the certificate, the mug, the T-shirt. That was sort of a recognition of your election into this elite society. I'm gonna work on this. Maybe that's that's phase 3. I mean, this is currently phase 2 of the podcast. I've decided. Now that I'm partnering with ARC Magazine, and maybe phase 3 involves kind of actual anointment of one sort or another.
Well, I'll wait for my retrospective T-shirt someday. Then.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll have to go back and send it out to everybody. So I was trying to think about where to start with you because there's a lot of ground to cover, both symbolically and almost literally. Not literally, but so much of what you write about is literally covering ground, often walking, hundreds, thousands of miles. But even if you're not walking or kayaking most of it, you're sort of moving slowly through the landscape. I think I want to start just because I was reading this morning just to sort of give people the flavor of who you are and what you do. I was just reading your posts this morning, and I don't know when you actually wrote them about that 5,500-mile hitchhiking trip you took from Alaska. I forget where you actually. I didn't forget. I haven't gotten to the end of it, so I don't know. I know you were going.
It's a four-series part. It takes you a while to get to the end.
I'm towards the end of part 3, but like you were going. The destination you identify is your girlfriend at the time. And maybe that word could be used loosely. Who is in Oregon? But I don't think that's 5,500 miles. Is it up from Alaska down to Oregon? You must have gone further. But anyway, let's start. I mean, we don't even need to get there yet. Why don't you set the scene? This is 2007. You're what, in your early 20s?
I must have been like 23 or something.
Okay.
Yeah, 24. So you want to know about this crazy hitchhike I went on?
Well, I want to start. You're up in Alaska doing what?
Oh boy, that's me just coming out of college. That's me just graduating with a boatload of student debt, 32,000, which is probably really ordinary by now, if not like less than average.
Yeah.
But back then it felt like a lot, and I just didn't have any means of paying it off in a fast way. So I wanted to be a journalist coming out of college. I wrote for the student newspaper. I loved writing opinion columns, movie reviews, stuff like that. But I sent out like 25 applications to newspaper internships, and I got rejected from every single one. And I had this massive debt. I had no idea what I was going to do. I had a part-time job back at my parents' house at the Home Depot pushing carts, and it's just like, this is not, I got to change something up. So I got a job up in northern Alaska, which had kind of always been a dream to go up to Alaska. So I went up there after college graduation, and I got a job as a tour guide. So I was driving people from this place called Coldfoot in the Arctic, about 250 miles north of the Arctic Circle, up the Dalton Highway, and we would just kind of talk about the tundra and the Brooks Range and the animals there. I also got to oar this giant boat down the Koyukuk River. So that was not a bad job coming out of university. And anyways, I'm paying off my debt. I spend a year there. I make $18,000 in a full year of work, which probably sounds pathetic to you. And it is pathetic. But
no, I think actually if I were to do the math on kind of inflation and think about the first real job I had after college, it would probably be about the same. And probably, I bet it was in Western Massachusetts, probably the cost of living in Western Massachusetts, if you did all the kind of equalizing of it, was much higher than I would think. Northern Alaska, though, you do end up sometimes with these weird things where if you're remote enough, some things are super cheap and some things are kind of unusually expensive. But no, that seems totally, that seems right.
Yeah, and like I had like no expenses at all, like literally no expenses. Food was provided, room was provided. If someone, if you wanted to get your hair cut, you asked your friend to cut your hair for you. There was no stores up there. You were just kind of like stuck 250 miles away from Fairbanks, and this was kind of before like the normalcy of Amazon and stuff like that. So I earned 18,000 and I saved 18,000.
Oh yeah, that was my next question. So how much of that did you net? So in a way, I mean, it's a crazy thing to do to kind of get ahead a little bit of your college debt, but in a way it was rather brilliant, right? Because you could have been somewhere else making like an inadequate salary, making us like a higher salary, but spending so much more that probably you netted much more than you would have in almost any other consideration, insofar as you were not a finance major and you weren't going to go to Wall Street and make a bunch of money after graduating.
It really worked out. If I was living in Buffalo, New York, making like a starting salary of $35,000 or something, I wouldn't have saved as much as earning $18,000 in Coldfoot, Alaska. So there goes more than half my debt there. And, at first I'm kind of like, what the hell? How did I end up here? I wanted to be a journalist, a writer, something. And, I become like a short order cook up there, and I'm cleaning lodge rooms. But it's just like we said, it's like, this is actually a pretty good place to pay off my debt. And I just become more and more independent and adventurous as that year goes on. I just start hiking up some of these Brooks Range mountains, and the summer in Alaska is actually really nice. It's 24-hour sunlight. The weather is pretty mild, and you have just all these mountains. Like, you get on top of one of these mountains and it looks like 1,000 miles to the left of you and 1,000 miles to the right of you is just pure wilderness, just these undulating 5,000-foot Brooks Range mountains inhabited by wolves and grizzly bears and caribou and moose and Dall sheep and all sorts of creatures. And, I'm living with a bunch of people who've, a lot of them are kind of like these carny-like workers who just kind of jump around from seasonal camp to seasonal camp and just make a life doing that. So I'm just kind of learning about their lives. And if you're going up to Coldfoot, Alaska, you're probably a little bit more adventurous than the average person. And one guy was just telling me all about his hitchhikes, something I never thought about doing. But once I went on a hike up north of Coldfoot, and I needed to get back down to camp, and this trucker was barreling down this gravel highway, and I stuck my thumb out. This is the first time I ever did it. And he picked me up, and he took me 30 miles back to camp. And it was unbelievable. He spent the whole ride, which was only half an hour, telling me about all of his extraterrestrial experiences he's had in the Arctic. You sleep in your truck up there, and he would pull over, and once he got out and he saw this enormous black triangle hovering above his truck, and another time there was like this fireball running alongside his truck, which could have been a lightning orb. That could have been like a legitimate natural phenomenon. But anyways, I was like, oh, that's awesome. I got to listen to all these stories, and I thought, you know what, my year's over here. I need to get back down to Buffalo, New York. That's why it's 5,500. I went all the way to Buffalo. And I thought, what if I hitchhike? Because not only becoming more independent and adventurous, but I'm far more conscious about spending my money, and I get radical about paying off my debt. It's just like, I want this thing gone. I want this ball and chain cut off my ankle. I want this debt murdered, and I want to do everything I can to pay it off as fast as possible. And that meant saving money and not going on a flight. So it was just kind of a mixture of all those different things, but also just kind of more of an existential thing. Like, I wanted to live the biggest, loudest, richest, most amazing life possible. And I wanted to be the best man I could be. And I thought, by starting to test myself on these physical journeys and kind of creating kind of some artificial struggle, which frankly I didn't experience. I didn't have that much to struggle over in my life. I grew up in kind of boring middle class Western New York suburb. I thought by creating artificial struggle, I might kind of fast forward my personhood, my development, whatever, and just kind of positively transform myself into a better person.
So a few questions before we get to the trip, because the trip is fascinating, the hitchhiking trip. One is, were you, even at this point, you'd said you wanted to be a journalist, but then you weren't doing that. But certainly, at least in retrospect, you're cultivating a kind of persona for yourself that's very aligned with a certain kind of writer, whether it's a beat writer or it's some kind of John Muir naturalist or something like that. Like, that is a type, right? And I'm wondering if you were conscious of that at the time. And then a kind of somewhat related, but not obviously related question, which is kind of what's coming into my mind of you at this point is, like, on the one hand, you said, you grew up in this pretty like normie middle class existence, but you feel, as you're describing your younger self, kind of unanchored in a way, like kind of alone. For good and ill, when I imagine myself at that age, I was just too tethered to the world that I came from to imagine doing something like that, to imagine going off to northern Alaska, kind of being on my own, to imagine, just hitchhiking and all sorts of, the danger part of it, but I think more just the uncertainty part of it. again, for good and ill. Like there were nice things to feeling kind of rooted in family or sort of culture in some ways. But then I was not the most adventurous of young men, nor the most adventurous of middle-aged men. So I mean, take those two things, in whatever order you want. Let me know if they sound right, if they sound wrong.
They sound good, and I want to answer both, but I should tell you that my brain doesn't have the capacity to hold two questions at once. So you're going to have to
Okay.
maybe ask that first one again.
All right, let me ask the first one again. Was were you consciously cultivating a sort of persona for yourself as a writer of a certain sort?
Well, I mean, it's a complicated question because no, I wasn't like I'm 21st century tramp.
Right.
I'm not trying to be something. But that said, I'm reading a lot, and that's influencing you. It's kind of getting me to explore possibilities, what I could do with my life, my self-image, how other people might see me in some way. So that stuff's kind of all happening probably on a very kind of unconscious level. I mean, like I remember like my favorite movie growing up was Braveheart. My parents showed it to me at 13, and I don't know if you would share that with your sons when they're 13.
I 100% would.
But yeah, like that's kind of like the hero's journey sort of thing that I was really drawn for, which would require a lot of like physical sacrifice and kind of a radicality as well, like that.
So it was not writerly, but that what was conscious to you was the kind of persona of a kind of man who lives life, takes life by the teeth and kind of shakes it. I want to read. Hold on, I'm just reading. This was the kind of at the top of your 4-part series on hitchhiking. You have this. I don't know if it's a passage from a Jack London poem. I would rather that my spark should burn out in a brilliant blaze than it should be stifled by dry rot. I would rather be a superb meteor, every atom of me in magnificent glow, than a sleepy impermanent planet. The function of man is to live, not to exist. I shall not waste my days trying to prolong them. I shall use my time.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, there's the Braveheart thing, all the other like constellation of influences. But I was reading plenty too. I was reading Jack London. Some of his stuff is just great. His short stories are great. John Muir, Henry David Thoreau. I was a bit of a travel writing addict at the time. I was reading a lot of that stuff. So that was kind of feeding this growing romanticism that I really embraced back then. The second part of your question is like, why wasn't I more tethered? I think that's a really interesting question, because you're kind of setting yourself up as a contrast. I don't know if you had like a strong neighborhood, maybe strong family influences,
Very strong family influences, very, in all sorts of complicated ways, and like both functional and dysfunctional. But the family, it wasn't so much the neighborhood; it was the family was very tightly tethered to each other, and I had various voices in my head kind of telling me who I should be or what I should do. And again, for good and ill, I mean, I think there were ways in which I certainly benefited that. But then there were sort of kind of internal psychological boundaries about what was even conceivable that I would do with my life.
Yeah, and I would say like the travel writing I was reading at the time, that really expanded what I thought to be possible. Maybe not only like physically what you could do, but how you could design your life. Like when you read Into the Wild or Walden by Thoreau, who builds a little 12-foot by 12-foot shack by the pond, or Chris McCandless, who goes up to Alaska and tries to live in the wild. Maybe you don't want to do either of those things, but you do begin to think like, wow, I could kind of take some of these stray dreams I have in the back of my mind, and maybe I could actually do them. Maybe I could kind of step off this conveyor belt that a lot of us feel like we're on and go on like a weird detour. So I think that's part of it. My family influences, I come from a very small family. Like my father, he's a Scottish immigrant. He had 7 or 8 siblings, but I never really got to meet any of them. They were all Scotland. And my mom had a very small family. She's from North Tonawanda, New York, just outside of Buffalo. And really, like, my whole family was me, my mom and dad, my younger brother, and my aunt. And that was it. So I didn't have any like positive patriarchs, some like grandfatherly figure or some like pushy grandma saying, no, you don't doing that. No, you got to get to college. Or I didn't have some uncle like hooking me up with a job so I could kind of get my right start. So I kind of had to, you can push back on this a lot because there's, you could probably definitely push back on this, but like self-made in some way, self-invented with all the wonderful privileges of, good schooling, stable parents, safe neighborhoods. So I'm not completely self-made, but I was kind of primed for self-invention just because I didn't have any clear pathways for me.
No, I wasn't going to push back. I was going to ask, it sounds like your parents were like good parents, but were not filling your head with all sorts of ideas of what you should be. Is that
no, and they had. I think my mom had, a 2-year nursing degree. My dad never finished high school, so there wasn't really any like pressure for me growing up to perform in school. I almost wish there was.
They were proud of you. You went off to college. You'd already exceeded in that sense of formal education. What either of them had done. Like, was their attitude basically like, this is great, like, unless he shows up on our doorstep, high on drugs and begging for cash or something like that. Like, Ken's doing well. I mean,
I'm sure I begged for cash at some point.
Well, the first part of it's important though. There's begging for cash, and there's down and out and begging for cash.
I think there was some hope for kind of a more ordinary life. I mean, when you look at kind of where my parents started, like my mother was really ashamed that her parents kept chickens, which is now like a cool thing to do. But like back then, it was kind of a sign of, like lower middle class or, verging on poverty. And my dad came from a council house, which is government housing in Scotland with his 8 brothers. All the brothers had to share a room together. So I think they had the expectation that I would kind of persist in this socioeconomic dream.
They had come up with a certain degree. They were hoping that you would, go another step or two beyond that or something like that.
My mom would under my boyhood door, she would kind of slide applications for like Niagara Falls Border Patrol jobs. So I could be like a Border Patrol guard and earn like a living. And while I had all these crazy romantic, passionate dreams of like jumping on trains and hitchhiking and climbing mountains in Alaska. So those two visions were very unaligned. And I think, I for whatever reason, I really listened to that inner voice more than I did kind of the parental and social expectations around me.
Okay, so let's set off on this voyage, this 5,500-mile voyage of hitchhiking. Obviously, I don't want to go through it step by step. I'm trying to think about how to structure it. I mean, I think there are different themes, and, one theme is just the crazy fucking people you meet. I mean, from day one, basically, like on this trip. I mean, it's funny. Obviously, you're starting out on this like it had been many, many decades since hitchhiking was a somewhat, I'm not sure to what degree it was ever a wholly normalized way of getting around the country, but like I don't think since the 60s or something like that, or maybe the 70s, I don't know, this was a thing that people typically did. So you were kind of venturing out into relatively uncharted territories, and there's all these narratives around that. And I would say it's funny in a way, like you stepped right into some version of those narratives, which is you're getting a lot of rides from truckers, and truckers, it sounds like, are fucking crazy. Not all of them, right? Like there were some normal ones, and then there's just other things. You're like picked up by the teenagers, and one of them wants you to like, I don't know exactly what this meant, pretend to be her boyfriend at some party they were going to. And
I don't know what
there's this woman who, I don't know if she was drunk when she picked you up, but she was certainly drunk soon after she picked you up. I think maybe she was like a, Native, I was going to say Native American woman, but it would have been Native Canadian woman. And she was on her way to some town where she was going to, get high and get drunk. And it sounds like she probably wanted to sleep with you, which sounded like a pretty unappetizing prospect. I mean, it's just one thing after another. I mean, I'm kind of summarizing, but why don't you you talk about that a little bit, because it is like, it's nice in a way, at least retrospectively, when you're reading the story, that is precisely the experiences that I want you as a reader to have. And it would be very disappointing if it turned out that like just ride after ride after ride was with like basically normal people or whatever, like pretty reasonable truckers who just, want to talk for a little bit, and, maybe their politics are a little different from yours and you have some kind of stimulating conversation. But like that, it was not the story. Like it was actually like true kind of like Americana, at least the part of it that I've been through so far.
Yeah, and I'm really grateful for those experiences. I think it did a couple things for me. It really, popped my suburban bubble. Going up to Alaska,
I wish you had just said it popped your suburban cherry, but
I think I was lucky enough to kind of take care of that beforehand. But
you're symbolic, not your actual cherry. You're symbolic. Your symbolic cherry of like being kind of in this, suburban bubble. But then anyway, keep going.
It did. It popped that suburban hymen or whatever we're calling it now.
Yeah.
Anyways, it exposed me to all sides of America. I was being picked up by people who literally just gotten out of jail. One guy was picking me up like on his way out of jail. Addicts, alcoholics, Latin Americans, Native Americans, people all up and down the kind of socioeconomic spectrum, and mainly down. I mean, it was mainly like people who are poor or semi-poor picking me up. And whenever like a fancy SUV was coming towards me, I'm like, there's no way that they're picking me up. But if it's like some beat up jalopy, it's like, okay, I'm probably going to get picked up. So it exposed me to kind of all of America. But I think it also cultivated in me this deep love of America. Like when you see so much kindness and charity coming from random people, it really changes how you think of people. And trust. Like I think in America we have this enormous deficit of trust, and some of it for our institutions, and some of that is very reasonable. But I would say our frayed trust for our fellow American is generally unreasonable. And that's what these hitchhikes did for me. It was like I could actually kind of navigate through this universe, through this country, without that kind of everyday fear and suspicion that a lot of people have. It completely changed the way I think about people. So yeah, I'll just tell one or two stories. For instance, like my first ride was with a trucker. He took me 500 miles to this little town called Delta Junction, which is just outside of Fairbanks. And he had just bought a Tommy gun, like one of those like 1930s gangster guns with a big barrel, and he just couldn't stop talking about it. And he'd go, rat-a-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat. He's like, when we get back to the gravel yard, we're going to go out there and test it. And, and there was also like a lot of deeper stuff. Like he would talk to me about sexual abuse that had happened in his family. He told me about his wife and his children. And right now I'm going to school to be a therapist. I'm kind of reinventing myself, but I kind of realized this was like my first foray into therapy. Like the hitchhiker gets a free ride, but it's not necessarily free. They're not asking you for money, but if you listen, that's kind of the payment you get. And oftentimes I could really prolong rides if I was a pleasant riding companion, and that was being a good listener, a good good companion. So yeah, anyway, we got back to Delta Junction. I fired a Tommy gun into a gravel yard. I got picked up by
and you met his wife and kids too, right? Like it's just funny because you start out this trip and this guy sounds like kind of a madman, and it's not that he wasn't in certain respects, but then you get to the end of the ride, he introduces you to his wife and kids who are like cute and nice. You have like, some snacks, and then you go fire the Tommy gun.
Yeah, and then right? Like his wife was gorgeous. His kids were so cute, and by that point, like he trusted me to like sleep in his house with his family, and that's what happens on a hitchhike. You sit with someone for 2 hours, and sometimes you feel like you've known them your whole life. Because what I notice is like people in a hitchhike, they don't hold back from what's going on in their minds, their family histories. I mean, they might share more with a hitchhiker than they would with their wife, with their best friends. Like, I got glimpses into these people's souls, histories, psyches. It was intoxicating in that way.
It's interesting, and this is just sort of coincidental. I was thinking of you this past weekend. I was working on a project that involves going with some folks out to West Texas, where this guy who I'm doing a podcast about grew up, like tiny town, Rotan, Texas. I think it was 3,000 when he was growing up, which was the height of its kind of, vitality. Now it's down to like 1,500 or 2,000 or something like this. And this is just a very like small data point. But at two different points on this trip, we ended up talking to people who were just, were of this town and, whatever, poor, working class, lower middle class, or something like that. And both of them approached us with some suspicion, and then once it was normalized, we couldn't get them to stop talking. And I mean, it's like precisely what you said. And I've been trying to process and figuring out what frame to put that in. And of course, it's 2 data points or something like that. But you've had a lot more data points, which is, there's different ways to think about it. One is, like, as you said, people are more trusting, they're more open than we think they are. Another is loneliness, maybe, right? Like, people are dealing with a lot and they're looking for outlets to say it. I'm not sure. I'm very early in kind of processing it. It just, when you were talking about it, it reminded me very much of these encounters I had. And as you said, the hitchhiker is in a sense the therapist, but even lower stakes, right? They're going to be talking to you for like 2 or 3 hours and they will never see you again, right? So the stakes of them sharing their, deepest, darkest secrets and thoughts with you are almost zero. And it's interesting that people avail themselves of that opportunity to just utterly unburden themselves in ways they might not. It might actually even take a while with a therapist, because the therapist is somebody who, not wholly in their world, but to some extent in their world, they'll see them again and things like that. I don't know. It's just...
Well, I mean, in therapy, they sometimes say if you only have a few sessions with someone, things get moving pretty fast. Like if you only have 4 sessions with someone, the work happens really fast. Whereas if, you have 2 years, it might take a long time to really get going. So I think we all kind of unconsciously knew, we're here for 2 hours, we're here for 6 hours, we're here for 8 hours. Let's make the most of it. So, but yeah, like what you speak of, I mean, it makes me think of a couple things. One, and kind of, I don't know if I should relegate this just to kind of MAGA America or wider America, but I think maybe in some of these rural cultures, there's kind of a difference between in-group and out-group. And if you become part of the in-group, they will treat you like family. Like, they'll like literally take a bullet for you. But if you're in the out-group, you can be a source of suspicion and paranoia. And like I lived in rural North Carolina for 7 years, next to folks who, raised the Confederate flag and had arsenals of guns and, some of the sweetest people in the world. And they would kind of look upon me as family because I was in the in-group. So I think there's kind of maybe like some of that going on. But I think like deep in the American soul, there is just such warmth and kindness and cheeriness and generosity. And I almost feel like our infrastructure smothers that to the point where it goes into like this deep recession, like a cicada going into ground and like, only being able to pop up here and there. So that's another fascination of mine, is like how we've really fucked ourselves with our built world.
I have so many mixed feelings about what you just said, because on the one hand, I feel like I have perceived that sort of warmth and trust and sweetness. And on the other hand, it feels like it coexists with, and I think this was evident in your writing about it, about this trip, it exists with this real brokenness and darkness. and so I don't know how to reconcile, like I don't, and I'm not saying this is the picture you're painting. Like there's one version of the picture you're painting, which is like actually people are all kind of warm and sweet and kind, but they've sort of artificially, for whatever variety of reasons, kind of enclosed that in a kind of, bubble around themselves or around their sort of small in group, and they're kind of looking from inside of that out with great suspicion at others. But inside it, there you can see their sort of depth and their wholeness. And I'm saying, well, the Confederate flag, the arsenal of guns, like the suspicion, the MAGA, and again, like you could find your counterparts not just in sort of right wing or rural culture. You could find it in urban culture and professional managerial class culture and all of these things. Like that goes as deep to me as the other stuff. I mean, and feel free to disagree. Like,
well, I mean, I struggle with this as well. Like so many of us, I'm trying to build like an accurate working model of the world. Like, how does America exist? What is the reality of America? I'm constantly like fine tuning that working model just to kind of make sense of this crazy world. And ever since 2016, we've all been like, how did this happen? What is America? Who are we? What do we really believe? Is like my Obama version of America in my mind, is that completely wrong? So I kind of vacillate between like, oh, you idiots, right, to like, oh, I kind of understand you if I kind of take this myriad variables into consideration. So that's kind of like my reptile brain. Oh, you dupes, you idiots. And then it's just like, there's so many things affecting why someone would kind of vote that way or think that way. So it's a big struggle for me. Ultimately, and this is oversimplifying it, I do believe in that inherent goodness and sweetness, and I feel like it's really been steered in the wrong direction by powers of propaganda. I feel like we probably turned a corner, I don't know, around the Gingrich years that kind of coincided with Fox News. So I see that as maybe a turning point when the powers of propaganda just really screwed over these people and disfigured their worldviews.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I don't want to get too sidetracked. This is just by way of affirmation. Like, there's still part of me that thinks that the impact of Fox News in particular, kind of for all that it's been written about, is radically underestimated. Like, just that there was this entity that, starting at that point, just started kind of regularly every day pouring poison into people's ears, I think has done an enormous amount of just sort of damage to our society. But you said you were going to tell like one or two stories. I think I stopped you after one story. What story two?
I mean, the first one to come to mind is actually on a different hitchhike. I've done about 10,000 miles of hitchhiking. So this one was...
And we don't need to stick to that trip. Also, where I want to go also, I mean, there's the part of your life and your kind of writing professional psychological journey that's kind of about going out there and meeting people. But then, in some ways, the bigger part of it is being in nature, sometimes alone, sometimes with one or two people or something like that, which is I mean, it's not unconnected, but it's a different realm, and I certainly want to get to that. And that's probably the bigger part of the work that you've done. But yeah, tell one more story from your hitchhiking.
I'll tell one more story. This one I was hiking with my then girlfriend at the time from Mississippi up to, again, Buffalo, New York, where my folks lived. And this was just outside of Lynchburg, Virginia. It was a rainy day. We're standing on the side of the road with a sign. I think the sign says Washington, D.C. We wanted to go see Washington, D.C. for the first time. Yeah. So this guy, Harry, pulls up in one of these like old falling apart jalopies. And one of the first things he said to us is that God spoke to him and told him to pick us up and to take us wherever we wanted to go. So he was from Lynchburg. He had nowhere to go. Oh, wow. But God told him to pick us up. And we're like, well, we're going to D.C., so you're welcome to take us there. And he spent the whole time talking about his religious, visions, hallucinations. And one of them was he had a son. And when his son was a baby, Harry began to experience insomnia because Harry had seen on the news how, babies die of crib death. They die in their cribs sometimes. So he just couldn't stop worrying about his baby dying. And this went on for like weeks, months. I don't know. He's losing sleep. He's going to get fired from his job. And then all of a sudden, he sees this marble toe, and he points out the windshield, and he looks at the horizon and says, it's as big as this whole horizon, this marble toe connected to a marble foot. And as he's seeing this marble foot, he hears a baby laughing. And then he says, that's when I knew that all babies go to heaven. And then I could relax, and my insomnia was solved. So those were the sort of kind of amazing, strange, weird stories I got to experience on the road.
So, I mean, let's pivot to your sort of nature writing, your nature journeys, just to give people a sense. I'm just looking at your website and kind of some of the books you've written. 2018, This Land is Our Land, How We Lost the Right to Roam and How to Take It Back. 2016, Trespassing Across America, and One Man's Epic Never Done Before and Sort of Illegal Hike Across the Heartland. 2013, Walden on Wheels, On the Open Road from Debt to Freedom. And then you have one from 2013, A Walk Across Suburbia. But, I mean, I think there's a theme here, which is Ken out in the world, sometimes in suburbia, sometimes on the highways, sometimes out in the middle of nowhere in deep nature, just kind of moving through the world in a way that most of us don't. So I mean, I'm trying to think of what the question to ask is maybe like, when did this begin to take shape for you as a kind of orientation towards the world, or a kind of writing and living that you wanted to do?
Well, I'd say like I might be my best self when I'm out alone in nature on kind of a predetermined A to B walk or travel or whatever. Like, who I am when I'm doing that is a much different person than if I'm playing, Barbies with my daughter, which is wonderful, but I'm probably like festering inside. I'm like, oh, this is torture.
I mean, I wasn't planning to get deep into the psyche this quickly, Ken, but like, that's an interesting way to think about it. I'm my best self, but of course you're saying you're your best self not in relation to other people. And in fact, the specific contrast.
Oh my goodness, you're therapizing me, right? You're right, though. You're right. I mean, you're putting your finger on something.
But it's interesting because the distinction you're drawing is really interesting, because it's to you actually being a really good father, right? So it's like, I'm actually my best self when I'm out in the world, out alone in the wild, beholden to no one, like with no responsibility other than to myself. And on the other hand, is this picture of domesticity where you're there on the floor playing Barbies with your daughter and maybe festering inside, but prioritizing the like needs of an attunement to your daughter. Like that's, I would not have ranked those the way that you did. But
I'm perspiring right now because you're finding a nerve ending in my psyche, and it's a major issue because I'm probably on the far end on the like introvert to extrovert spectrum. I'm definitely hardcore introvert. I really like being alone for long periods of time. As you said, I've written multiple books. Those are acts of loneliness. I've been on these enormous hitchhikes and hikes, and there's little oases of people on those trips, but huge periods where I'm just kind of on my own. I wrote a piece on Substack a couple years ago called "Journalism as a Way of Being," and like when I'm in kind of journalist mode, that is when I feel like I'm like my best self, because I'm just so open to the world. I'm like observing everything. I got like my little notepad and I'm describing the trees or how the wind plays against them. I'm really interested in people. I'll knock on a door and introduce myself and interview them. So it's just kind of a completely different way of being than normal life. So I'll say that, like, I just feel like my best self when I'm out there.
Well, I kind of want to bracket best because that has a kind of value judgment attached to it, and just sort of like, maybe try to think more precisely. But you're it's something. In my mind, it's more like you are. Whether it's like you feel most at home in the world, you feel most centered, you're deriving the most pleasure. I'm not sure, like putting best aside, that makes sense to me. No intention to be dismissive of you. And in fact, it's part of what I'm interested in because it's, it's so different from me. Not in some ways. I like being alone and like doing certain kinds of things, doing, writing or creative endeavor or something like that. But the kind of the extent of it for you is much more extreme. It's also interesting, like being a journalist, and this goes back in a sense to what you were saying about these hitchhiking experiences, which is journalism is a kind of passport to brief, bounded, but often quite intense intimacy of a type, right? So you have this persona that you put on of journalist, where you can just go up to people and ask them almost anything, or ask them questions that in normal life would be really inappropriate to ask, right? If you shared a social world, and you can have these super intense, intimate feeling experiences, and then most of the time they're over, and you may never see that person again. And I don't say that in a dismissive way. Those are very real. They're just a real of a certain kind that's very different from family, friends, coworkers, things like that.
And I think a better person, not to put another value word on it, but a more deliberate-minded person could bring that kind of journalism approach just to normal life as well, and be as interested in people and the nature around you, even when you're not on assignment. So I guess that might be
I agree. That is a very
goal of mine.
That's a very rare state to be in. It's interesting because this is like I was talking to my wife, who, as you know, also a therapist, last night about this, and she was talking about a client who was like had gotten like super into collecting stamps, and this was somebody who had kind of addiction issues in the past of various destructive sorts, and we were sort of talking about you always have to kind of negotiate with who you are and what your tendencies are, where you feel most at home in the world, what activities help you kind of sublimate some kind of wild or sort of potentially destructive energy. And it's like, if you're a certain kind of addictive personality, let's say, like oftentimes health is not going to be, it's never going to be eliminating those addictive tendencies. That just might not be in the cards for you. It's finding channels for them, collecting stamps or something like that, or whatever it is, that are much less destructive than other channels for them. I'm just thinking about you. I mean, you have, I think it sounds like in a healthy way, and I know it's taken you a long time to kind of get to somewhere where it's kind of in balance. It's a mix, right? Like Ken needs to go out on, walkabout periodically to stay sane, and then can come back with some resources and be a good, domestic dad and husband and therapist and whatever else. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of take me back to summer 2017, which was like a big fork in the road for me. I was 34 at the time. I was an established writer by then. I was just finishing up my third book, and I would work summers as a park ranger in Alaska, which was a really nice combination. Like a little bit of wildness and adventure during the summers. I could live somewhere else and write for the rest of the year. Makes like plenty of money doing both things. But yeah, during the summer of 2017, I found myself living on the shores of Lake Clark National Park in southern Alaska, which nobody has heard of, but it's like 3.5 million acres. It's got volcanoes and glaciers, and one of the highest densities of coastal brown bears in the world. It's not too far from what's that movie with Timothy Treadwell where he got eaten alive in Katmai National Park? It's not
Wait,
far.
Is that the one where like was that the one that
Werner Herzog?
Werner Herzog did that documentary.
Grizzly Man.
Great documentary. Yeah. Okay.
Oh yeah. So it's right next to there, and I'm living with all these grizzly bears. I'm seeing 30 of them every single day. I'm living by myself in this cabin. I'm sharing the shore with these bears. Like, part of my job was to patrol the shore, and we would walk past each other.
You're totally alone, right? Basically,
I'm totally, yeah. I mean, there's tourists who pop in every day to see these bears, so I'm seeing tourists, but I'm living by myself, surrounded by bears. I mean, once a bear jumped over the electric fence and started scratching itself on the column, the timber column on my porch. It was terrifying. But yeah, so that was kind of a big fork in the road for me, because it was like, what am I doing? Like, I'm 34, and I think I was kind of living the life my younger self needed to live, which is to get out of suburbia, go on some transformative journey, test yourself physically, mentally, embrace solitude, learn from it, and come back home. But I never really came back home. I just kept living that dream over and over again. So my constant form of movement was a stasis in and of itself. Right. And it was then I realized I actually need to go on a different journey. I need to kind of domesticate myself. I need to
find a wife.
I need to date properly.
Right.
Like, because there was like, there's no, I mean, I remember I turned Tinder on when I was in that cabin, and I had to extend the mileage range like 100 miles just to get like 2 matches. And I was flirting with this Inuit woman on the coast, and I was like, could I make this work? It was just completely ridiculous.
Right.
But anyways, yeah, I wanted a community. I wanted a country. I wanted a home. I wanted a family. I wanted a wife. And, I would still always have this side of myself which wants to embark on some, very difficult point A to point B journey that has some meaningful purpose behind it. I still have that in me, like right now. But I also recognize that to live the best life possible, I need to kind of bring everything into balance. And yeah, so that would start a new journey, but a very
It's interesting. I was thinking about like that life you're talking about up in Alaska, hanging out with the grizzlies. Like, it's a version of what I think is an incredibly powerful kind of especially male fantasy in our culture. And I'm sure there's other versions of it in other culture. And I was thinking it's a funny comparison. I think I was thinking of it just because I was watching something on Amazon Prime last night, and they've been pushing promotion of the next season of Reacher, the show Reacher, which is coming soon. Have you ever watched that show? Do you know the premise?
No,
the Lee Child
I'm guessing it's some strong man in combat with too many other men.
Yes. Well, so, I mean, it's a series. It started out as a series of novels, immensely popular novels. And the premise, Reacher is this massively, he's like 6'4", 6'6", built like a linebacker, learned his trade in the military police. He's a great investigator and an amazing fighter. And after he gets out of the military, and this is, the connection, he decides he just wants to be utterly free for the rest of his life. So he walks the world, or he takes buses, walks the world in, the clothes on his back, his wallet, and then he, like, wherever he is when he runs low on money, he just goes to, like, the Western Union and collects something, his military pension or something like that. And then, but all the novels are he lands in some town, and there's some problem to solve, right? That involves him kicking an enormous amount of ass, killing a lot of people, having sex with a hot woman who, happens to cross paths with him. And it's just like there's so much emphasis in these books. I mean, I think most of them start with just like the utter freedom that Reacher has. And, he's like the most core American essence, like he's the freest man alive, right? And it's such a powerful fantasy, and I'm not saying there's no reality to it, but it's interesting, right? And in Texas, there's versions of it. In Texas, a lot of it is like, someday I will go out, I'll own a piece of land, I'll own a ranch, and there's these kind of vast open spaces in Texas, right? Like, and I will, have my cattle or something like that, and I'll be, I think often in the fantasies, I'll be alone most of the time, and once in a while, whatever, I can have a drink with my neighbors, a few times a week or something like that. But I'm out kind of looking out at the vast open sky and the land, clearing brush, whatever it is one does on a ranch, tending to the cattle. it's very powerful.
I've got two thoughts. The first is that is kind of like a dream for so many Americans. Like, oh, we need that cabin in the woods. There used to be this website called like Cabin Porn, which was just like beautiful, cabins in some natural setting, and I find that to be the wrong way to think about it. I feel like we need community porn, which is you need to rebrand that for me.
But yes, I know, we need some better terminology. But express what you mean. What do you?
Yeah, we need pictures of like kids being able to walk to school, or like a really walkable neighborhood, or block parties, or communal space. Like this whole idea of having a ranch out in the middle of the field. I mean, yeah, go live that life and see if you end up being happy. I think you're going to be suffocated by your own loneliness and solitude. I feel like you're not going to have enough connections with people. I just find it, and this is coming from like a hyper individualistic person. I think it's just a bad dream to have.
I mean, I think one thing I really want to get into with you, because this is something that I kind of have glimpses of in my own life, but I think kind of I envy or admire your capacity to experience just kind of the natural world. But I had this thought reading your stuff, and one of the things we can talk about, but maybe we won't, is kind of issues of like depopulation, overpopulation. What is the because some of the stuff you've written is sort of thinking about maybe what would be nice about a kind of diminished human presence on the planet. Though you also, and I'm uneasy with that, the idea of kind of fewer humans or sort of a dwindling human population, but you're sensitive to that. But I think one of the things that struck me as I was thinking about it in my orientation towards these questions and towards questions of climate change and things like that is that that I think a lot of us are kind of staving off an immense sadness about this sort of extraordinary destruction of the natural world that the human species has wrought. And so there's other kinds of fantasies, and I think you're a very conscious, thoughtful kind of adventurer into these realms of this fantasy. There is the kind of depopulation fantasy, which is a restoration of the natural world and ecosystems for, animals, insects, whatever, that's also very powerful. And I think in my own life, I'm kind of keeping at bay what it would really feel like to feel the sadness and how much of the natural will be destroyed, but then I guess how much of my life doesn't exist in relation to that.
Yeah, this is kind of a pet passion of mine. Like when you look at how depopulation is represented in mainstream media, it's almost entirely about like the possible human cost of it. Fewer babies mean fewer taxpayers, fewer soldiers, who's going to take care of the old people, that sort of thing. I mean, the New York Times, as much as I love and admire and sometimes write for the New York Times, I feel like we just haven't heard the whole picture on that. And it's just like, why are we worrying about a voluntary lowering of the human population and never really considering, never once factoring in what this means for the rest of the living world? I mean, we're pretty close to the same age. I'm 43. What are you, like 50? Yeah. So like when we were born, what was the human population? It was probably closer to 5 billion, 6 billion. So we've just in our lifetimes, we've seen several billion people added to our lives. So the very thought of it possibly going back down to, what it was at the start of our lives, 5 billion, like why does that freak us out so much? I just feel like and I feel like it's such an opportunity for the natural world to reassert itself. Like, I mean, I just see so much habitat given over to agriculture, to urban space, to suburban sprawl. I mean, we don't even need to begin to list all the extinctions or the acidification of the ocean. Like, I'm really on the natural world's side on this debate, and that doesn't mean at the exclusion of humans. I'm not misanthropic. I just think we, as much as we can, need to adopt an ecocentric worldview, as opposed to an anthropocentric. An ecocentric still factors in people.
Interesting that your perspective is that like the sort of mainstream conventional opinion is kind of hostile to depopulation, because I experience it as a kind of like things going like two very opposing narratives in play. One is, what, just for the sake of convenience, we'll say like the neoliberal kind of concern about depopulation, which is the one you described. We're talking about, all the sort of potential economic costs of, just it's not just fewer children, then it's an aging of the population and, whatever, all of these things, right? That is certainly present. That's strong. And I've actually worked with some faculty here at UT Austin who are kind of advocates of that perspective, which I think they're kind of thoughtful advocates of that perspective. But the counter narrative, which is one I think to this point of experience as the more powerful one in the spaces I occupy, is a kind of, I guess I would say, a kind of gestalty environmentalist thing, where if you said to somebody, whatever, at like, in my neighborhood or in deep blue Austin or something like that, like the population is gonna go down, they'd be like, that sounds pretty good, right? And I think the kind of loose kind of syllogism in their head is like fewer people, less climate change. I think when I say like the faculty I've worked with, one of the things they argue, I think pretty persuasively, is that those are actually really separate issues. That like it's not clear at all that like at the pace that depopulation would occur if current trends continue, it just will not happen remotely fast enough to mitigate climate change in the time scale that we're worried about. And if you kind of played it out and you think about kind of alternative sources of energy, like it's just not much of a solution to climate change, right? But I think your angle is, you're less focused on that, I think, on the climate change piece of it and the way in which, the quantity of people on the planet poses a threat of like, ultimate human extinction or catastrophe because we ruin the planet so much. You, at least in the stuff of yours I've read, are much more focused on the ways in which, and this is very true, and you there's an article you write about kind of depopulation in Spain, which I think has like a, fertility rate of 1 or something like that.
1.1, yeah.
1.1 is just, there's just these places that are just abandoned, right? There's like these small towns, there's these regions where it's just like nature's taking over again. So put aside climate change, put aside, CO2 in the air, or, keeping the sun's heat trapped on Earth or something like that. You're just saying literally there's all this space, and then when you're part of what you're talking about when you're doing this trek with your nephew is people who are trying to stitch together vast areas of land in Montana and the American West to create kind of contiguous prairie lands. You're just about space that we can maybe give back to nature in a sort of thoughtful way so that it can return to sort of some more healthy state, equilibrium.
Yeah. I mean, I'm working on a book proposal for this. I've been working on it for months. I had the idea after I read this book by Dan Flores, Wild New World, just kind of talking about the history of North American wildlife. And when you look back just 15,000 years ago, I mean, North America had a Serengeti that would rival the African Serengeti in not only quantity of animals but biodiversity. I mean, that's a blink of a geologic eye that this continent had camels, various horse species, cheetahs, lions, mammoth. So then, I got to thinking about that and seeing kind of like what's happening on the ground that not many people are noticing. I thought, I think the future is going to be far wilder than any of us can possibly imagine, partly because of depopulation. That is a voluntary thing that is happening worldwide. It's going to hit its peak at about 2080 and then begin to kind of gradually come down. So if you just kind of set aside the 21st century and maybe the 22nd century and look 500 years into the future based on these projections, things start to look really interesting. And then you see projects like American Prairie, which you mentioned a couple times. This is about my Montana trip. This is probably the boldest conservation project in the world, and nobody knows about it. I mean, I've spoken to like directors of environmental studies programs. They're like, what is American Prairie? And I was like, okay, well, let me tell you. So it started by this guy named Sean Garrity, and he and some others, the WWF, kind of looked at where you could kind of do landscape scale reserve. Like, where could you kind of create like a landscape scale reserve or wildlife refuge out of nothing, where kind of nothing exists. And they identified north central Montana as a place where you could kind of build this 3.2 million acre refuge out of nothing. And they thought they could do it just using the ordinary rules and laws of private property acquisition. So they raise some money, they buy some land off of farmers and ranchers, and out there's just their heirs don't want to take over the farm. Yep. Nobody wants to live there. It's a very hard life. So they're selling to this private organization, American Prairie, and amassing these huge bodies of land and then connecting them to federal land that you and I own, whether it's National Forest land, Bureau of Land Management land, or some other existing refuges down there. And what they're doing is just amazing. They brought the bison back. There's wolves coming back in. Someday there's going to be a prairie grizzly bear. I find things like that so awe-inspiring and amazing. And whilst we're in this sixth extinction and the Anthropocene, just some amazing things are happening in the background that give me amazing hope for the future.
What? Yeah, it's funny. It was pleasure. It has been pleasurable, kind of immersing myself in your stuff, because it is pretty hopeful, right? And of course, one could, someone who is more catastrophizing or more focused on the things that we're doing that are kind of harming the climate or the environment or the ecosystems could not poke holes in your reporting, but just focus on different things. I did find it pleasurable and also sad, I think, at the same time, as what I was talking about, to read your stuff. Pleasurable because you can see kind of realistic things that are being done, that are powerful, that are kind of restoring parts of the wild without really coming into too much conflict. And you articulate some of the conflicts on the margins, but not really coming into too much conflict with human life and human vitality. I think the sadness is just the witness to what's out there, what most of us are disconnected from, and all that we've lost. When you describe these scenes, and I've read these before, of what the prairie was like 15,000 years ago, or even a few hundred years ago, right? It's like when you read these stories about, swarms of passenger pigeons being so thick that they like darken the sky or something like that. And then you're just like, how far we are from that kind of abundance in this country.
What are your thoughts on de-extinction, Dan?
De-extinction, you mean like restoring the woolly mammoth or the oryx or the whatever?
What's your kind of the knee-jerk reaction to that?
Oh, I fucking love it.
You do? Okay.
I think it's awesome. I mean, I am too much of a science fiction reading nerd to not think that it's just fucking amazing that people want to bring back the woolly mammoth and all of these, and the saber-toothed tiger and whatever. I think it's fucking awesome. What do you think? I have no objection to it whatsoever. And then there's all these arguments you can make on the ways in which some of these species, if we were to store them, could actually do a lot of work to kind of restore some of these ecosystems to better balance and more hospitable to other species or something like that. I mean, do you have any ambivalence? I have no ambivalence whatsoever.
I really don't have much ambivalence. I'd have to kind of force myself to have some ambivalence. But yeah, I was lucky enough to be able to do a press tour of Colossal Biosciences labs.
I was kind of jealous. That was
in Dallas, Texas. What had happened was when I had Dan Flores on my podcast, he just kind of accidentally let slip a little secret of Colossal, and Colossal got in touch with me. Can you edit that out of your podcast? It'd be my tiny little podcast. So I edited it out, and they were glad enough to offer me a little press tour of their labs, and it was unbelievable. So de-extinction, for anybody who doesn't know what it is, it's kind of studying the genetic material of long extinct species such as the woolly mammoth, which really only went extinct 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. That's the the Egyptians were putting up pyramids when that was happening. To study that genetic material and to kind of, I don't know, take an Asian elephant, an existing elephant, and make the genetic modifications to their genome so that it will resemble an extinct mammoth. So it's not necessarily a real mammoth. It's more like a highly edited Asian elephant that will come to look like a woolly mammoth. And it's the same thing with the direwolf. Any listeners who kind of saw, the cover of Time magazine or whatever, they've taken a gray wolf and aggressively edited the genome there. I can't use these terms sophisticated at all. I'm not a scientist. And they a gray wolf gave birth to something that looks like a dire wolf. And they think of it less as kind of an exact replica of these extinct species and more like something that could fill the ecological role that was long lost. So, in my utopia, if I'm allowed to think a couple 100 years into the future, I would just love the idea of mammoth roaming the Arctic steppe. I would love to think of passenger pigeons flying over the now blighted American chestnut, which some scientists are working on reviving. I would love to think of kind of huge areas, an American Serengeti brought back to life and reanimated, perhaps with just pre-Columbian animals. But hell, if you want to bring back the American cheetah and the American camel,
I do.
I do. that would be even great. And I think, where does this come from? I think when you talk to de-extinctionists, when you ask them like what their motivations are, they almost always have this kind of knee-jerk, it's for the ecological role, and right. I respect that, right. But I think they're like bullshit. But I think they're maybe kind of deliberately, I don't know, hiding is the right word, but they're just kind of putting off the whole enchantment side of things, the romance side of things, and that's where I'm very. I feel like I'm very open about. I want to live in an enchanted world. I want to live in a resurrected world. I want to live in a world that has an everyday sublimeness to it that can kind of strike awe in me. Like the sort of feelings I had roaming over the Brooks Range and getting on one of those mountaintops and seeing nothing but pure wilderness. I feel like almost every human should have access to those feelings, and it could be our great kind of 21st and 22nd century project, at once an act of penance and also an act of repair. I see it as a multi-decade, multi-century cathedral-like building project where we rebuild the wild. I think if we use our godlike abilities not to destroy as we have done, but to invent, create, repair, I just think that would be such an inspiring project to renew all our faiths in our species.
Amen, brother. Eminent Americans, the podcast, is a production of the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis. It is edited and produced by David Sugarman in his capacities as deputy editor of ARC magazine. So thanks to David, to his ARC colleague and brother o' mine, Mark Oppenheimer, and to the rest of the crew at the Danforth Center. Subscribe and rate Eminent Americans on the podcast listening platform of your choice. And always feel free to reach out to me with questions, comments, etc. at djops@gmail.com. That's djopps@gmail.com. Have a lovely day. Peace.